But I think, for someone starting in the business, whether it's as an intern or as an assistant or as an agent, frankly, the goal of our work is client service at the end of the day. We're here to service another artist. I think someone who is willing to put their own ego aside in that sense is really important.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Happy December. She's in a new outfit and a new location. Welcome, welcome. I see we have attendees joining us now from across the country. So thank you for being here for this incredible network panel that we've got set up for you to discuss the role of an agent. It's my ultimate pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's session. Eric Forrest Jackson is a playwright, musical book writer, and novelist, and a member of the American Theater Wing's advisory committee for the past 10 years. Eric, it is so wonderful to have you today, and I can't wait for you to lead this conversation for us.
Thank you, Megan. It's so good to be here. I am always honored to take part in the Wing's incredible programs. And I'm so looking forward to this particular session because we have three of the brightest lights in agenting who've given us their time today to share their paths into their career, how they got there, and maybe share tips on how our attendees might get there themselves as well. So I'm going to keep the bio short because I know everyone's here for information, not resumes, and I know you've probably all done your homework and know who these folks are. So I'll introduce Di Glazer, who is a partner and co-head of the theater department at ICM Partners. We also want to welcome Kevin Lin, who is a talent and literary agent at CAA, Creative Artists Agency. And we have Ben Sands, who is an agent and partner at in the New York office of Artists and Representatives. So welcome, everybody. They're going to appear like magic. Hey, and there everybody is. Thank you all for joining us today, for giving us your time. And let's just dive right in. I'd love to find out from each of you kind of what your path toward becoming an agent was. Was it something you set out to do, or did you have a career goal to be an agent, or did you want to be something else in the industry? And how did you get there? Di, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. I was in my 20s expecting to have a career as a producer, and I worked for a number of commercial producers, and in that time was also doing a lot of work developing and producing my own projects at the Fringe and NYMF and such. And as I set out to stop being an assistant to these folks, the economy went to crap. And I spent some time freelancing in that crappy economy and kind of looked up and realized, I'm not really in a place in my life where I want to be freelancing. I really want to be kind of at the center of things. And I knew that that's kind of the position in many ways that agents had. And I also knew that agents were salaried and got health insurance. So the sort of combination of stability and communality and sort of producing muscles that felt very similar led me to pursue a career as an agent. And so I decided I was going to pursue a job as an assistant, specifically for a number of reasons, wanted to work for a department head. And so when a job opened up at ICM, I reached out. I knew the person who had the job before me and said, is this something I'd be interested in? And ostensibly 3 days later, I was in the office starting.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Kevin, what was your path toward agenting?
I had no intention of ending up here at all. My parents are both immigrants from China. They're physics PhDs, and I always grew up thinking I was going to be a scientist. So my undergrad was in evolutionary biology. While I was studying, I had started to intern a little bit at the American Repertory Theater just as an extracurricular activity. And I figured that post-graduating college and before starting grad school for conservation biology, I'd find an internship in theater because I remember saying to my mom, I'm never going to do this professionally. I might as well just spend the summer doing something in theater that I love. And for various reasons, I wanted to make sure there was a paid internship, and the only paid internship at the time that I could find in the theater industry as a whole was at CAA. So I started there in the summer of 2012 and ended up withdrawing my grad school applications completely. Figured I'd stick it out a little bit, see what happened. And I've been there 9 going on 10 years.
Fantastic. I want to come back to the idea of internships because I know that's very important for a lot of folks. But first, we'll jump to Ben. Ben, how did you wind up in this role in this industry?
I started acting professionally when I was a kid. So I started acting professionally when I was 11 years old, and I basically had like a whole career in that lane. And then I went to school to be an actor. I went to Boston University to their acting conservatory, and then graduated, moved to New York, and immediately thought, this is not the life for me. I wanted, as I was saying, I wanted more stability. I wanted more structure. And I sort of interned around at the time. I interned for a casting director for 6 months full time. I interned for a producer. I interned for a director. And then I actually went into my agent's office and asked if I could intern for him, which kind of miraculously he said yes. I think he knew that I was already not really wanting to pursue the acting anymore. So I got very lucky and was in the right time. I interned for him, loved it, became his assistant very quickly, and then was his assistant for a little less than a year when he left to start his own agency with another agent, and they took me with them and franchised me. And so I suddenly was, 24 and an agent in New York, and then I just sort of progressed from there.
Wow, incredible. So you guys both you springboarded off internships, and a lot of people, see that as being great for connections. What about those that are unable to take, say, an unpaid internship? How can they get their foot in the door?
I don't know about the rest of you guys, but it sounds like, Kevin, when you were an intern, CAA was already paying. ICM is the same deal. We pay our interns. I think legally now everyone has to pay their interns. So I also did an intern. I did a number of internships, before I pursued agenting. And in many of those internships, I was paid not well, but enough to put towards some of my expenses, and often would take on other jobs outside of those hours to make up the difference. And I think that is the nature of the theater world. There are, I think it's perhaps an ugly truth, but ultimately there are more people than there are well-paid jobs, and the country does not fund the theater the way it needs to be funded. And that is not the theater's fault, but I think that that's a reality people aren't talking about, but oftentimes it's about cobbling together, the internship, plus for me, it was like the babysitting, working in the patrons lounge at MTC, answering the phones, tutoring. It was a melange of things.
Yeah, I think that experience of having 2 or 3 jobs when you're starting out is not an unusual one. I wish it was something that would go away, because I think for all the talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, getting new perspectives at the table, especially in the agency world, which has predominantly been a place for straight white men previously, right? I think this group is unusual in the sense of how representative we are. But when we're talking about making space for queer people, for women, for trans and non-binary folks, for people of color, I think unpaid internships don't do us any service to that end, right? You're talking about people who don't come from a whole lot of money, or who don't already come from the industry. So when I was looking, I think my first choice internships would have been at the Public or the Roundabout, and neither of them paid anything, and I couldn't afford to take those jobs. So I'm not a producer as a result. I'm an agent here, which I'm thrilled about, right? I think it all worked out in the way that it should. But I think the conversation about paying interns and paying for labor, whether that's at an agency or at a production company or at a nonprofit theater, is something that we're all pushing for.
I also would say that it takes some courage and it takes some willpower, but all we want to find, and I run the training program, there's a whole bunch of kind of programming at ICM involved in terms of early career folks. All we want to find are people that are genuinely excited. And I think that where there's a will, there's a way. So if you find that there's an internship or an opportunity, whether it's qualified as an internship or not, that is exciting to you, I think it's really important and likely to be successful to say to folks, hey, listen, is there anything else that you can do to sort of bump the salary up, my living expenses? This just won't work for me. And if not, is there anything that you might be able to hook me up with that might allow me to get to this number per week? because obviously it's not just about a one-off job here or there. If you're looking to like, how am I going to budget out in my month? I need to pay rent, whatever, student loans, etc. A lot of the time there are ways that people can say, you know what, I actually think we can pay you the full internship, stipend every week. Maybe you only do 30 hours. It sounds like you're going to be able to get that work done. We actually have a client that needs some help with transcription, making this up, right? And I think that would kind of get you to what you need, but just asking, I think it can be uncomfortable. And I recognize I'm saying that from a position of the other side, but I think it will be highly unlikely that there wouldn't be some solutions that could be found if you're willing to make the ask.
So guts are key.
Always.
So let's say a young candidate comes in for an interview to intern with one of you, or for a job that's opened up, and they are young and they have minimal experience in the industry. What transferable skills do you look for? What key experience is necessary for you to take them seriously and potentially hire them?
Yeah, I'll jump in. We actually just hired 2 new assistants as we came back to our offices. We don't have an internship program at all. We only hire assistant level position. And there was one assistant position where we were looking for a little bit more experience, someone who had assistant position before and sort of knew the names of the people that we were going to talk to and sort of the basic flow. And then there was another assistant position that we just hired that was a brand new entry level. And really what I was looking for were, in terms of transferable skills, were someone who was highly organized, was able to sort of like listen and articulate their workflow, how they take in directives from multiple places and how they prioritize how they function basically. And then also because we are in the arts, and I only want assistants here basically who ultimately want to be agents. I think that's the reason to do an assistant position at an agency, because it's never going to pay as much as an assistant position in many other industries. So, I want to know where they're coming from. Like, what did you see recently that you liked? What theater, what film, what television? I want you to be able to talk about actors because we're only actors. We don't do any lit. So, I want someone who can engage in that conversation and at least sort of have a point of view. So yeah.
Great. Kevin, what about you? Somebody comes in looking for a gig. What are you looking for in them?
Yeah, I think the criteria for us is a little bit different. And I wonder if it's more similar sort of to Dai's experience, given the size of our companies, right? Because I think, the agency world is also, there's such a diversity of business models, right? The work that Artists Reps does is very different than what CAA does, very different than what The Mind does, very different in many ways than what ICM and UTA do, right? We each have sort of our specialty in some way or another. I think for the like large, multinational agencies, often we have assistants and interns coming in who have no intention of being agents whatsoever. And I think that's totally cool. I would say of my 5 assistants that I've had so far, none of them are agents, but 3 of them are producers. And that's great because I can call my Moneyar, who now works with Christine Schwartzman and Darren Johnston, and ask her for help on projects that I'm negotiating with her, right? I think it all sort of stays in that ecosystem. But I think, for someone starting in the business, whether it's as an intern or as an assistant or as an agent, frankly, the goal of our work is client service at the end of the day. We're here to service another artist. I think someone who is willing to put their own ego aside in that sense is really important. And because the work of an intern and assistant largely in the beginning, especially, is administrative too, right? Where I expect to be treated as the client of my assistant, right? So that I can do the work of servicing the clients that I represent. So I think it takes a certain type of person who is curious enough, right? Or wildly curious to learn about the business through that perspective, but who also doesn't need to be the center of attention in their first job, which is sometimes a difficult balance to strike.
Wonderful. Dai, what about you? What are the key elements?
I think Kevin hit the nail on the head with a lot of those. I think that there's a level of preparedness, and doing your homework is a big thing, right? It's not hard to find out. Maybe it's not a full roster, but if you're interviewing with me for an assistant position, for example, you can look up my name in ICM and you can see at least a good amount of the people that I represent. And a lot of those people have plays that are published. So if you come to the table and you haven't read anything by any of the writers I represent, that's a pretty big red flag for me. Things along those lines, right? I'm not gonna say fake it, but it's like if someone came in and they had an opinion about a number of shows that that I represent or directors that I represent, and they can speak to that. I don't need to see your ticket stub. I just need to see that you understand that demonstrating preparedness is essential. That's really the key thing there. Everything you said to me is subsumed in that, like making it about the work.
Great. And negotiating, Kevin, you mentioned negotiating, which obviously is a huge portion of the gig. How does somebody build their negotiating chops?
I think the agency world is an apprenticeship model still, right? I think a lot of contemporary businesses are no longer that way. But I think the way that I learned how to be an agent was by watching agents do the thing. I don't think there are some books written here and there. There's a history of CIA type book. There's the Mailroom that I think most people have read, but I've learned that process of negotiation by watching my peers do it, by watching Jason Cooper lead negotiations, frankly, by being on the phone with colleagues like Dai and Derek Zaksky and hearing their perspectives on how to advocate for their clients. So at the end of the day, whether we work at the same agency or not, we're all advocating for artists, right? We're trying to get the best deals so that our artists can do their jobs to the best of their ability. And the negotiation process also varies from industry to industry. So as when I'm working in the film and television space, there's different precedents, there's different sort of standards of business versus the theater space.
Great.
Yeah, I want to jump in just because I love what you said, Kevin, about the apprenticeship model. And I think that I agree. Like I've been at this company for a little over 10 years. I've had 4 assistants, and all of them, every single one of them is an agent at this point. And then I have a new 5th who I just started. Yeah, well, it's because I view so much of my job as I don't want an assistant. I want a mentee. I want someone who's going to be out in the industry. And there's the negotiation aspect, which obviously is important. And I agree that the only way to really learn, aside from negotiation fundamentals, which certainly, like, I've read books and I've taken classes that are not specific to this industry, but just to, especially since I came from such an arts background, I was like, I really need to understand the fundamentals of business here about how to have these kinds of conversations. And so I took that upon myself to educate myself. But in terms of the specifics of our industry, the only way to know is to do it, to have the experiences. And a big part of being an agent, or any rep for that matter, I think, is understanding the how to network and how to activate your network to get what you need. So as I was coming up and started at a very small agency that did a very specific kind of work, and right at the beginning of my career, my first test deal, and I needed to figure out how to do that in the best way possible to serve my clients. And what I realized at the agency I was at the time is that I didn't have the resources within that agency to go to the people and ask them, to go to the right person who would really know. And so what I did was I called a couple of different managers that I had met here or there, or that, whoever I felt close with trusted enough to get that information, to have them walk me through. And that ultimately, obviously that's one tiny example, but I've done that at every stage of my career. So much, and it's so much of what a skill of what we have to do as agents is, whether it's calling the casting director or the producer or whomever to say, this is what we need for our clients. I learned how to do that for myself as I was coming up through the business by marshaling the network of contacts that I had.
Mm-hmm. Dai, how did you nurture your negotiating prowess?
I'd say a lot of what Kevin and Ben have said. The apprenticeship idea is really at the core of it, because when you get a deal, you have to decide how you get a proposal from somebody for an artist you represent. You have to decide how are you going to respond. And that's based on what are you looking to get. And then you kind of, if you imagine the movie version, there's, a file in your head of at this point, thousands of deals I've either done, witnessed as an assistant, been party to, looked at in reference to something else. And you're going through to say, like, what's similar? What are some reference points to sort of create a bit of a map to sort of identify where does this sit? Where are the precedents? What are the standards? And a lot of deals, I mean, depends on what it is, but you know, if you're in a union, there are some basic things that are laid out that are the minimums, but you have some sort of touchstones based on your experience. And then that has to be overlain with what you know about this artist, this project, and the buyer, right? What is important to the artist? What do they need? What is a nice to have? What will make them feel comfortable financially? What will this look like if it has a successful run? If it has a insanely successful run, what does this look like for them if there's failure? So you have to kind of go through, okay, if I agree to X, then what does it look like in each of these scenarios? I personally, depending on the client, but a lot of my clients, like I think, respond to this sort of, okay, let's take through like, okay, if you get this royalty, let's say it's like a great hit, this is what you'll get, just to help them really feel like they've metabolized it, which I'd say 50% of the way, it gets them 50% of the way there. And then I think most artists would say it's not until they actually have the experience of doing some of these projects that they really can understand, oh, I get now what that point was. When you were telling me about it, it was really theoretical, but you have to really understand the big picture and then the minutia of the project and the person. For some artists, they are really happy to bet on themselves and say, you know what, like bonus me if things are successful. I want to be, you know, rolling in money and I'm willing to bet on myself. And for some people, they're, you know, they either prefer something more conservative or they have a need for cash flow to happen quickly. And that's really about understanding the artists you work with in some ways better than they know themselves, to say like what's going to make them freak out in a year, what's going to make them feel good at the end of that workshop. So it's not a simple thing. There are a lot of layers to it, but it's the kind of muscle that develops over time, hence the apprenticeship question. And part of the reason I think all of us aren't speaking to you from our, you know, shingles where it's just us and nobody else, is that there's amazing value to having a group of colleagues that have all of that expertise, often with decades and decades before you. So like, I'll go into an office sometimes and be like, this is an interesting thing. And they'll be like, well, there was a deal I remember from 1987. And I love that because I'm a theater nerd, but also it's really freaking helpful to be able to say to a client, hey, here's some examples. And they actually know those shows and they know those artists. So it can actually make it feel tangible to them.
So it sounds like agenting is a big portion of the pie is psychological. You're as much a sort of therapist as you are a business person. I'm curious how would you define the most important role of being an agent? Kevin, you said client services. Is it getting them the most money? Is it nurturing them to the best work? What is at the top of the pyramid for you?
Well, I think the reason the negotiations are so complex is because the math gets really sticky when we're talking about human beings, right? It's not like we're selling candles. If I'm the candle salesman and someone wants to buy 50 candles instead of 20 candles, I'm going to give them 50 candles. Great. But if we have a client who is being asked to do maybe an incredible film or an incredible TV series, but at the same time, they're planning a family and they don't know what that's going to look like, or they need to pay for a mortgage, you know, I think there's a lot of gray area there. And I think the client service at the end of the day is about the client, it's about what they want. So it's going to vary from case to case. It's going to vary from day to day, right? An artist may wake up on a Monday morning and say, hey, you know, that play that I signed up for a year-long run, it just sounds really exhausting now. I don't want to do it anymore. Or I want to make the term shorter. I think, you know, the reason that we all have jobs is because we love the artists that we work with. And they are the first priority. I don't think it's just their business. I think it's their full humanity. I think, you know, knowing Ben and Di a little bit, like, I think that's true for all of us in the way that we approach how we work with our clients is that, you know, if I have a client who says, I need to take 3 years off to raise my child, I'm not going to force them to do a show because it's going to make them money if their priorities are elsewhere. Of course, I want them to be able to pay for their rent and pay for tuition and all those things. But so long as they're taken care of and so long as they're comfortable, then I think my job is fulfilled.
Ben, what about you? What do you see as your sort of the most important part of your role as an agent?
Yeah, I agree with so much of what Kevin said. And I honestly think a big part of our job is to be that outside perspective who understands sort of like what what is fair? What is a fair deal for any artist based on sort of where they are, what the industry looks like at that time, help them understand sort of the playing field and zoom out, because obviously they're in the middle of their one, it's the one thing that they are thinking about right now. And we can zoom out and say, well, this is where everything lands. And so much of it is really being able to articulate what that deal looks like in terms of the scope of the industry. And then the other side of that is really listening to them and to so that we can understand where they're coming from, and then they can make an educated choice. And I think that there's certainly a version of agenting, which I don't subscribe to, which is sort of much more bombastic and controlling. But I come from the school of, it's my job to make sure that the artist is making what I call a full choice. And I use that terminology as like, they understand absolutely everything. That means they understand worst case scenarios that could happen. That means they understand best case scenarios that could happen. They can really see, and then they make a choice based on what's best for them at that moment, knowing literally all of the variables that we can possibly come up with at the time. So yeah, I mean, I think that's probably the number one job for me, is making sure that a client isn't, a week into a job, 2 months into a job, a year into a job, and saying, what the heck happened here? How did I end up in this place? I want them to have thought it all the way through and make the choice. And even if things go south, which, let's be honest, that happens in every job at some point for everyone, no matter what, in every career, I should say, not every job, but at some point things are going to go wrong. But what I want is for the artist to say, oh, I knew this could happen because we had thought about it, we had talked about it. And then you move forward based on where you are then, instead of being like, how did I end up here?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that ultimately what your job is to create trust. And I think that is at the bottom nature of what allows a relationship to be successful. I know that sounds kind of like woo-woo, but I always think about this as like, it just sounds weirdly like morbid or dark, but I think of it as like a doctor and patient relationship, right? Like how I am with my doctor, what I want my doctor to do. I don't want my doctor to bullshit me. I want them to make time for me. I want them to help me understand things. I want them to, be proactive, not just like, let things go. Be like, oh, by the way, did you like forget to get your annual physical? I want them to like reach out. I want them to do that. But what I also know is that doctors are not wizards. And I want a doctor who's going to say to me, hey, here's the deal. Lay stuff out and say, none of this is a guarantee. Let's say I have to make a medical decision. None of this is a guarantee, but I want to know what they would do in my shoes. And I want to, and that only works if I trust them, because they're not saying, hey, this is definitely going to be fine. Here you go. It'll fix it. But I want to know if there's a tricky situation, and a lot of our jobs are involved gray area, that the client trusts me to say, look, it's your decision, but if I were in your shoes, I would do this, and this is why. And if the client doesn't really trust that you understand them, where they're coming from, the things that Kevin mentioned, then that conversation has no weight, and you are neutered as an agent. So you need to build that trust through all those different opportunities to engage in the work, get to know them as a person, hear their concerns, listen for the things that aren't being said, etc.
So it's the client-agent relationship is very intimate. And as with all intimate relationships, sometimes things go bad. So when it comes time to part ways, how do you do it? Have you dropped clients? What was your technique? Skills you could share for future agents to, let people down easy?
Yeah, I think I've parted ways with clients have parted ways with me. It goes both ways, right? We're in a very human business where also people change, right? People change, careers change, and what people need at different points in the careers shift and grow. My advice always is hard conversations don't get any easier by putting them off. So you might as well just rip off the Band-Aid and accept that a breakup is a breakup, right? When you're ending a very deeply personal relationship, is going to be hard, no matter what side of it you're on. I think actually if the relationship, if the breakup is really easy, that means the relationship wasn't strong to begin with, and it shouldn't have been there from the start. So I think for any hard conversation, whether it's in the agent context or not, I prefer to just get it over with.
Ben, what about you? How do you approach it?
Yeah, I agree. And, I tend to, we don't have a whole lot of churn at our agency. We have, sort of our group of people, and we always like to, we have many, many clients that have been with us for over 10 years, 20 years, et cetera. Not to say that it never happens. And when it does, because we have sort of a contained enough list that I feel like I have a relationship, a real relationship with these actors, I come back to, there's a personal aspect of our relationship, but ultimately this is a business relationship and it needs to be productive. And it is, if it is not productive for the artist, then it is not productive for us. And if there's an issue, first of all, it's very rare that I'm, ending a relationship without some sort of a preamble of like, oh, we're having an issue, let's talk about it. I bring up, I'm a very direct person. I bring up an issue with an artist if if it's they're not booking, or if it's something that they're doing that I think is getting in their way. I've usually had that conversation, and if we ultimately reach the point where it's not productive for long enough, then I typically have the conversation of, look, this obviously isn't productive for you either, and that doesn't mean you're bad, and it doesn't mean we're bad. It means that together, we're not producing, and there could be another agent who sees you in a slightly different way that's putting you up for other things that are the right things. I could be getting you auditions, but if they're not the right auditions for you, then I'm not the right agent, even though you're wonderful and I'm a fan of yours. So it becomes about taking the emotions out of it in that moment to be like, I will still see you hopefully around New York City, and we will still be friends, and I will still be your fan, and I'd be excited to see your work and see you at opening night and all of those things. But it needs to create. We need to work together to create. And if we can't do that, then it's not in service of the artist for them to stay with us in that moment, so that's typically how I approach it.
We had talked about internships, and I know a lot of folks who are tuned in are interested in getting into the business. If the internship isn't the way to do it, or they're not able to do that for whatever reason, how does one go about networking? What's the best way to network within the sort of agent industry or theatrical industry that would lead to a career in being an agent? Di, do you want to maybe, any thoughts?
Sure. I mean, I think it really depends on which kind of what kind of career you're interested in, right? If you want to work with actors or you want to work with like playwrights, or I mean, those are all different paths. I mean, you can be networking throughout all of those. I think it's going to the theater is number one, right? You meet people, you go with people, calling people, reaching out to people. You have to be proactive. And I think that can be daunting. But I think when you figure out, for example, oh, I want to have a job like X. Okay, who are the people that have that job? Okay, reaching out to all of those people. Probably not all of them will respond. Maybe it's only a handful, but chances are at least a couple of them will be willing to have a conversation, and being, truly prepared, keeping it short and asking the questions that will help you get information to do something. Whether it's, I really like your work, I would love to find a way to work on something you're doing. These are my interests. These are my skills. Is there anything that you have where that might be an opportunity? I know you have a show coming up. I saw there was a workshop of X. That's really exciting to me. Is there any opportunity to work with you on that? That type of thing. Reaching out is the best way, because it's, and including flattery and specific stuff is the way to go. Like, I've gotten so much, interest from people, I would say primarily through, like, I went to Northwestern, so through those alumni channels, right? And I'm almost always happy to make time to have a quick conversation. I will be honest and say most of those conversations are pretty general. I wish there was a little bit more specific information that people were looking for. And I think that's tricky, but I think you have to really say to yourself, what do I need from this person in order to take the next steps in my career? And not be afraid to ask some questions that might be, again, a little uncomfortable. is there an opportunity to work with you? This is why I want to do that. These are the other things I'm doing that are, I think, aligned with this goal. So that you're demonstrating proactivity and a strategy.
So if that email
I have
pops
two
in-
things that I wanted to add to that because I think it's brilliant, and I just want to add, which is one, in terms of going to the theater, yes, 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 and also I think people, especially younger people who don't necessarily know the New York scene as intimately as we do, who have been here for a long time, is people think Broadway or they think major off Broadway. There's an entire world of downtown, and I can't even tell you the number of shows that I went to when I moved to New York and was trying to understand the scene, where the barrier to entry isn't $100 or more a ticket, where you can go to a showcase for $10 and you can find those cool, like the Club Thumbs of the world and the Le Frere Corbusier before Alex Timbers was Alex Timbers. That was his company, where literally, like, I got a ticket for like $5 to one of his things. That's when I first met him and became a fan of his work. There's so much that is so much more accessible in the theater world in New York than we typically think of at a first level. So I think that's an important thing to say, is like broaden your scope and understand where you are in the industry. And that, especially if you are looking not necessarily to like immediately go in and pick Di's or Kevin's or My Brain in like an hour-long meet and greet, but like look at the other people who are around your age, who are at around your level of experience, and like form those relationships and trust that over time those people are going to help you. And then the second thing that I was just thinking about in addition is just a little bit of patience and a little bit of understanding that if you do have the opportunity to speak to, in this case, Di, because she's the one who brought it up, and you do have the uncomfortable conversation of like, well, do you have an opportunity for me right this moment? That answer might not be yes, but it might eventually become yes. Patience is so important in our industry, and you keep planting seeds and planting seeds and planting seeds. And there are plenty of times that I've met someone, and then especially because we don't hire very much and there really isn't much of a churn, where like I'll meet someone because someone referred them to me in some way. I'll sit down for 20 minutes and then I'll keep that resume on file. And I can tell you the next time that I'm hiring, I go to my—
It's also, we all get inquiries from people being like, I need a new assistant. Is there anyone you know? Like, I think I would say more opportunity. I've got so many people jobs based on having happened to meet them, or someone mentioned to me, oh, like my niece, blah, 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 or like I did a general or one of these panels or whatever. And then someone happens to send me like a inquiry about needing a new assistant, and all they want is somebody to make their job easier, right? Hire this person. But you know what's never happened to me, and I just can't understand why, because it was obvious. Like, I wish that somebody who wanted to work for me, like, sent me a script that they thought I might like afterwards, that they think I might not know. Hey, I'm in my 20s. You're an old fogey. You might not know about this cool young writer. I just thought you'd like it. Here's why I like it. I reached out to them, like that proactivity. Like I would just like find a way to hire them regardless, but it's odd to me. It's like, if you want to demonstrate that you have a proclivity towards this job, there's nothing that I'd like more than you being like, do you know this script? Do you know this writer?
You're totally right that there's nothing stopping folks from doing the job, right? If that's the job you're going for, and our goal for all three of us is to find new talent and to sign new artists, and you can tee up someone for us to work with, that's going to get you the job. But like that, like I have a folder of resumes on my desktop right now of people looking for jobs who I cannot hire right now. I have one assistant. But I would also agree with Ben's point that referrals are really powerful, right? So if you're looking to work, I think for me, if I was looking to be Di Glazer's assistant, I would try to be best friends with her current assistant, because I know that when she's looking for a replacement, there's someone immediately on the desk who can be a very close referral. The person that I go to first when I'm looking for a new assistant is my outgoing assistant. Yeah. So anyone who wants to work for me, go talk to Andrew Harlan. He's fully accessible.
Totally. And nothing like works like flattering someone's assistant who's like happy to be like, yeah, I have the keys to the castle. I mean, it's not that hard.
That's great. Ben, you've taught, I believe, a business of the business class. Are you still teaching that?
I do whenever people want me to. The way that came about, honestly, is that there were a bunch of universities that that sort of reach out to agents to say, come in and see the work of our seniors or of all of our students. And I reached the point where, you know, agents are very specific, and I was sort of like, acting itself is subjective, and I could go into a huge speech about my opinion, but ultimately, like, my opinion doesn't really matter unless I'm representing you, is kind of the basic point there. I was like, but what we can do to make this time way more productive for way more actors in your class is that I can provide information about how the business actually works. And so that idea sort of occurred to me. I think it was the first time that it occurred to me was I was going to University of Michigan to deal with their seniors in their acting and musical theater worlds. And I was sort of like, rather than the one person that I might sign from that class eventually, why not teach this? Why not teach this course? And they kind of bit, and then I sort of created the syllabus, and then it honestly went over so well, because schools are not designed to have people on faculty who have the expertise of understanding what the casting process is really like, what sort of like minimum rates are for the different mediums, and sort of helping them get an idea of why people, meaning actors, want the kinds of careers that they want and sort of what their priorities are. So I created that, and then it went over really well. And then I started offering it to the various universities that I already had relationships with. And so you know, whenever someone calls on me to do it, I do it.
I feel like there are hundreds of people listening in right now who might be interested in that. Is there a follow-up is there information that they could find out? Would you post it somewhere?
Sure. I mean, honestly,
I put you on the spot, but
no, of course. I mean, honestly, my contact information is very accessible, particularly my email address. It's like everywhere. So basically, it would be a university, like, you know, in terms of protecting my time and energy output. I typically would only really want to go into like an established university and educational program to do it. But it's really like the equivalent of like a masterclass in a masterclass program. It's like I can do a one-off that's a couple of hours. I can do a series of 4 classes, because there's literally always more to talk about. Let's like sort of just scratch the surface of the basic concepts in the class. So, you know, reach out to me and see if I can do it, and I probably will.
Are there any educational paths or classes out there that you guys know of or would recommend? Is it necessary to go to school to be an agent? Kevin?
No, I absolutely not. I mean, my degree is all but useless. I also think that, well, again, when we're talking about accessibility, like, there's a barrier to entry for folks to get a college education in this country, right? So I think whether you can afford to go to college or not, whether you've already done 4 years of college, but I have colleagues who are starting as assistants at CA after they've been lawyers for 4 years. I have a colleague who dropped out of medical school to become an assistant because he had a change of heart in terms of what he wanted to do with his career. I sort of wish he had stayed as a doctor, but he's a great agent. I think there's no basic requirement for what it takes to be an agent educationally. I think it takes the personality is more important, and curiosity.
And guts, I think I might add.
I think we all would.
So before we jump over to the questions from the attendees, I wanted to speak a little bit about representation and equity in the American theater, and your experience as agents, either being BIPOC or queer or a woman or anything, you know, underrepresented. How are you going about advocating for your clients that fall under those umbrellas? How are you going about trying to find equity in this sort of new phase that we're in, this great new world? How
much time do we have?
Say it again.
How much time do we have? I feel like
you do it in a few minutes.
It's a massive conversation, right? Because I think as progressive and as liberal as the theater community can be, there are so many systems and structures in our industry that remain quite backwards. I've looked up to Di for a long time as one of very few women doing the job here, right? And I don't think it's an accident. It's not that male identifying individuals are inherently more qualified to be agents than female identifying individuals. It doesn't matter, right? But there are systemic issues that have for so long prevented folks from underrepresented backgrounds from breaking into this world. And I think that's something that we're all very conscious about, right? Is like, how do we create space and create opportunities and hire assistants who are from marginalized backgrounds? But I think when it comes to representing artists, for me, I've always gravitated towards artists of color and queer artists, because those are my communities. Those are the people that I hang out with socially. Those are the people that I gravitate towards in the corner of a party when I don't know anyone else in the room. I'll go find the other Chinese person there. It just happens that way, or the other queer person there. And I feel like it's been very organic. And I will say, in this year, especially for the first time in many instances, I felt really fully liberated to say that. I think it was more difficult to articulate so bluntly in the past, saying, I really love representing Asian writers because I relate to their story in a different way. I don't think I would have said that 4 years ago. But I think that's, it feels like a superpower now rather than an oddity, if that makes sense.
Gosh, that more than makes sense. That's beautiful. I love it. Di, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think, oh, there's so many thoughts. We don't have time, but I'd say, like, I feel like at any moment I've always represented a really eclectic group of artists in terms of like style, identity, etc. And I always gravitate. I find what I gravitate to is a mix. Like I hate being bored more than like anything else. And for me, that's driven me to work with, people from like Teresa Rebeck to Lauren Yee to like the Debate Society to Pigpen Theater Company. And like, when you really are interested and excited about things that mix it up, like it would be really hard to imagine that being like, well, here's a list of like any one type of play or by one type of writer. And I think I've also, again, as a queer woman, I'm sort of like, I get what it is to not be like the default. And so I think I identify with that. And as a female agent, yeah, like in a world where that's just not an easy or kind of, it's not that it's not expected. I think there are a lot of female agents. I think what we see is that most women who have established careers as agents leave when they have children, because there's a lot about this career that is seemingly incompatible. I'm like looking at the high chair over my shoulder. Like, I'm really optimistic that there are ways for it to happen, and it requires teamwork. It requires communication. It requires knowing yourself and your limits and prioritization and good time management and a lot of things that demand a lot of you. And I like, for me, it was important to be established before I had kids. So I kind of could not be trying to create a business and career while creating life. But I think at the end of the day, you have to know what you're passionate enough about to advocate for on the most challenging days of your career, because that's your job. And if what you're passionate about is certain stories, then that's what you're going to represent. And if you do it well, that's going to be what your list looks like.
Fantastic. Ben, did you have anything you wanted to add in terms of representation and equity?
The only thing, I guess, is, I feel like I have always, like Kevin, been drawn to more diverse communities of artists. That just tends to be the art that I consume and like. And because of a long personal story that is so not important, basically, I realized from a very young age how much representation was important. And, I have been lucky enough to make a career, particularly as someone who was coming from very small, a very small agency to start with, my sort of old agency, that, the only way that I had access to the high level of artists that I really wanted was in more diverse communities, because the larger, more powerful agencies at the time didn't want those artists. And I was like, they're incredible. And, I have so many stories I could point to of like, an episode of Law and Order where they were looking for a doctor, and it came out and it was like white male 50s. And I called and I was like, why couldn't this be a woman? And why couldn't this be a woman of color? And then, she, of course, I get a client in and she books the job and she's like, it was me and 4 white guys in the room and I was so happy. And, those conversations have progressed in a really beautiful way in the last 15 years to the place where now I regularly have conversations with casting about, if we're talking racially, about like, is one of your creative team members a POC? Like, are we like, it's going beyond who the actor is at this point, which I think is really, really valuable and I'm so happy about. And then we're also having conversations about like, have you thought about size diversity? Have you thought about gender? All of those things, because of how much the representation in our business matters for those marginalized communities. Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately it's an important conversation to continue to have. And honestly, like, I really value that the younger generation that's coming up now is, I'll say, like, I don't know the right word exactly, but like feels so strongly about this and is holding our generation accountable about these issues. I think it's really important to continue to do that, to continue to bring it up, to continue to say, like, put it on the table and be like, this is a topic that we can all discuss. And I want to make sure that you're thinking about. And then the last thing is that honestly, in my experience, which obviously is only my own, I think the theater industry has been the slowest industry to change, which honestly, that makes sense because it's such an old, entrenched, like, Phantom is not a new property. They can't just sort of like pivot and change what the show is and what it's about. They can obviously take steps to make, the representation more diverse on stage, and they can bring in new creative team members, et cetera. That's stuff that they can do, but ultimately, like, there is a very entrenched groove there for decades, whereas a new television show is, starting from scratch, and so they can create that in a totally different way. So I think in this moment where theater had this huge pause, and we all had this sort of racial reckoning and this conversation that's gone on, I think it's really important as we all really come back in earnest to, especially for new theater projects, to really have the conversation and to really hold the producers and the casting directors and the agents and everybody accountable to not just have lip service about this. Like, let's take action. Enough talk, although obviously talk is part of it, but we want action, we want change. The way to do that is in your actual hiring practices, in your actually having a consultant on to help navigate these issues, whatever it is. There are lots of different solutions, but yeah, I mean, long story short, I guess my message to the younger folks is hold us accountable, keep bringing it up.
And I would just add that for all those listening, these conversations are the work. This is the job that we do on a daily basis. It's the conversations around representation are literally why we have jobs. It's not an afterthought when we talk about body type or gender or race, ethnicity. This is part of the evolution of the industry that we all want to see.
Fantastic. So we've got 5 minutes or so, and we have a few questions that folks have sent in. So maybe I'll fire off 3, and one of you each can take them. The first one: how many clients does an agent typically manage, and how do you make sure you're attending to each of their needs?
I don't think there's a number, because in some ways we each have clients that we are kind of the most on point for, like we're their primary person, or we have the longest established relationship, or we're the one working with them on their current project, but normally somebody else does it. So, and then there are people that you're in their lives because a colleague asked you to step in. So there's not actually like an accurate number. I think that they would just be making that up. So I think that the more, I guess, important question would be, how do you make sure you're attending to their needs? And I'm like, yeah, that's the challenge, making sure you're attending to everybody's needs. And I think most people are either absolutely not hesitant to let you know if they feel like they are not getting the time they need, or they kind of sit and sulk, and you can't read anybody's mind. But I think we all feel like one of our primary jobs is to allocate our time appropriately based on urgency, importance, earnings, etc., and knowing people. And usually COVID is a weird moment, but like when you have clients working on TV shows and films and theater and things, is enough, think of it like a solar system. Like everybody's working on different things. You have clients that are really busy and on set, and they're not looking for a big strategy call in that moment, but maybe another client is. And so it's not that you're dealing with every single person you interact with every single day. It depends on the project, and it tends to have a decent balance.
Got it. There's a question in here about, what's the best way to find a publicly posted internship or assistant opportunity? Does that kind of stuff get posted? Is there any kind of?
Yeah, I think in not COVID times though, like generally, if you look at the website, you can always reach out. There's usually a general inquiry note on almost every agency's website. And if not, you can always email, Ben at his own very available email address and say, I'd love an internship. Could you keep my resume on file? I didn't see anything posted.
There's also a website called entertainmentcareers.net, and it has job postings for lots of different positions in various areas of the entertainment industry.
And I think theater jobs often get posted on Playbill as well.
Great. We have just a couple more minutes, and why don't we finish on a very positive note? If each of you could tell us, what is your favorite part of being an agent? Ben?
To me, my favorite part, I think, is, there's so many. I really do love it. But I think one of the things that I often say is that an artist calls me on the worst professional day of their year when everything goes wrong. And on some level, agents are problem solvers. We're crisis actors. We sort of take a problem and fix it. And a lot of times that, for me, the way that I start that process and oftentimes finish that process, to be perfectly honest, is communication. And my superpower, if I were to point to one, is it's being a middle child and understanding how to be the diplomat, is that I can really hear what different people are not only saying, but what they ultimately mean. And a lot of times, whether it's, going between the producers and the actor, or whether it's between another team, whomever, just hearing where everyone is coming from and getting everyone to understand the other side and sort of come to a place where it's not about egos and it's not about, what it is about is fixing the problem, finding a solution, getting everybody what they need to get the work done. So when that happens, and when I am able to successfully fix those problems and get everybody on all sides feeling good and better about the path forward, that's my favorite.
Guy, what about you? Favorite part?
I would say it's really hard. You obviously working with incredibly successful clients is thrilling, and there's something just wonderful about being able to be with somebody in the height of their career. But there's very little that compares to making the call to tell somebody that you've gotten them like a life-changing first deal. That is, I'm getting chills thinking about it, because it's a combination of, you can see them say, I'm going to have a career, I'm going to be able to do this. And oftentimes when it's a really significant opportunity to say, you're going to pay off all your loans, or you can, to say you can quit your day job. That's a beautiful thing.
Oh yes, I'm getting chills just imagining it. Kevin, what about you? Your favorite thing?
I was going to say the same as Di, is that moment where our younger clients especially can say, oh great, I don't have to go wait tables tonight, and really focus on my art for the first time in my life. Or I had a client one time say, oh great, now my husband can finally retire. His husband's like 45, he wasn't ready to retire, but he could retire and they could go pursue a new career. Since Di already said it, I would say the matchmaking part of it I love, which is putting clients together and watching those relationships, those chemistries turn into, yes, professional relationships and incredible projects, but also sometimes deeply personal relationships. I had a client this afternoon email me saying, thank you so much for telling me about Ashley all those years ago. We are now sisters for life, and she was at my wedding and all those things. I love those moments too.
That's great. Well, I feel like you guys have given so much useful information, your expertise, your experience. Thank you so much for sharing that with us today. I'm inspired. I'm feeling like I need to change careers, but I can never live up to you three. So thank you again on behalf of the Wing.